Okay, so today we're going to be using experimental probability to make predictions about something that's going to happen in the future. So, number one, the experimental probability that it will rain on any given day in Houston, Texas is about 15%. Out of 365 days, about how many days can the residents predict rain? Okay, so we are going to be making a proportion. If you remember, a proportion is two fractions that are equal to each other. We're going to use the probability that they give us at first, and then we're going to use that to make a prediction about what's going to happen over the next 365 days. So it says 15% is the chance of rain on any given day. So 15%, it doesn't look like that's a probability, but if we remember percent is always out of 100, that is actually 15 out of 100. Because that is the percent that they will get rain out of the total. So I always like to write it in words like this to help me know exactly where my numbers should go and what I'm looking for. So about 15% chance that there is going to be rain out of a total of 100. That is going to help me figure out how many days, so we're always going to have an unknown, how many days there will be rain out of 365 total days. So you're always going to have two totals on the bottom, and then you're going to have two things on the top, but you're always going to have an unknown. That's what we're going to be solving for. So we want to know how many days there will be out of 365 days. So how many days of rain? So if you remember, if we have a proportion like this, it's called cross multiplication. A lot of you remember it as butterfly, but we call it cross multiplication or cross product. So we're going to be multiplying 365 times 15, and then we're going to divide by 100 because that is what is across from the x diagonally. So we're going to do 15 times 365 and then divide that by 100. Okay. So I want you to always tell me what is x. X is 54.75, and then I want you to put it in like a sentence answer. So that means there's going to be about 54 days of rain out of the 365 days. Okay, next one. If a car factory checks 360 cars and 8 of them have defects, how many will have defects out of 1,260? All right, so let's circle our numbers. We are figuring out how many will have defects out of 1,260. So again, we're starting with the probability that they're giving us. So we want to know how many have defects out of the total. So it said 8 of them had defects out of 360. So if we follow that pattern, we want to know how many will have defects out of 1,260. Okay, so again, you can see by writing it out in words, you can know exactly where to put your numbers so that your totals are on the bottom. So we want to know how many will have defects out of 1,260. So we're going to be multiplying 8 times 1260, and we're going to divide by 360. So 8 times 1,260 divided by 360. All right, so x equals 28. And in sentence form, that means about 28 will have defects. Okay, number 3, the probability of winning money on a particular scratch and win ticket is said to be 3 out of 10. 3 out of 10. If Miss C buys 25 tickets to hand out to her students, how many of those would you predict to be winners? How many of those would you predict to be winners? Okay, so if we write it out in words, we want to know how many will be winners out of the total. Total always goes on the bottom. So they're giving us the probability of 3 out of 10 are expected to be winners, 3 out of 10. So if we keep that probability, if we keep that pattern, we want to know how many will be winners out of 25. So again, using our cross products, 3 times 25 divided by 10. 3 times 25 divided by 10 is 7.5. So x equals 7.5, and that means about, we'll say about 7 tickets will be winners. So remember, if it's a decimal, remember that doesn't mean that 8 tickets will be winners because we can't round up. That means only 7 and half more will be winners. So we'll just round it down to 7. Okay, last one. The theater class made copies of a flyer advertising the school play. Before handing out the flyers, the class inspected the printing quality. Out of the first 8 copies inspected, 7 were acceptable. Okay, so this one's going to be a kind of a tricky question. Out of 56 flyers, how many flyers can the class expect to be not acceptable? Okay, so now it threw in another step that we're going to have to do. So before, it just was very straightforward. How many will be winners? How many will have defects? How many days of rain? But so this one tells you 7 were acceptable, but we have to go a step farther and figure out how many of those 8 were not acceptable. So in our words, we know we're finding out how many will be not acceptable out of the total. We are not going to write 7 out of 8 because 7 were acceptable. So we have to go, like I said, a step further and figure out, okay, we have to see 7 were acceptable. There was 8 total. So that means there's going to be 1 of those 8 copies that was not acceptable. 1 of the 8 original copies were not acceptable. So it's not going to tell you anywhere in the question that 1 was not acceptable. You have to figure out from what they're telling you how many are left over. So 7 out of 8 were good. 1 out of 8 was not good. 1 out of 8 was not acceptable. So be careful of that wording. Make sure you're knowing what your question is asking. So 1 was not acceptable out of 8. So we want to know how many will not be acceptable out of 56. So using your cross products, we're going to do 56 times 1. We didn't really need to do that, but we will do it anyways. 56 times 1 is 56 divided by 8 is 7. So that means 7, we'll say about 7 copies were not acceptable.